Hey Year 12s! Today we're discussing Wildcat Falling by Mundaroo in relation to identity and belonging. If this isn't one of your texts, or you haven't watched that video on identity and belonging yet, stop, go watch that first and come back. There are 4 possible texts you could be studying for identity and belonging, of which this is one. Make sure you're not watching videos for texts you're not studying. Alright, on to Wildcat Falling, which I'll just call Wildcat or the book from now on. Mundaroo's novel engages extensively with the ideas of identity and belonging. The central character is young, still developing a sense of self, and significantly influenced by those around him and the experiences he's had. Furthermore, the protagonist likes to think of himself distinct from attachments, drawing in considerations of the need and effect of a sense of belonging. At the heart of the text is the effect of one's heritage and the tension that existed between Aboriginality and white Australia in 1965, when the novel was first published. If you're hoping to use Mundaroo as inspiration for creative writing, or you want to analyse his style in a bit more depth, consider the following. The symbolically nameless protagonist, the central character of the story, is never identified by his first name. This can be a tool to represent the all-too-common experience of Aboriginal youth with incarceration and a confused sense of heritage and belonging. The 1960s setting of the novel is seen through language choices like bodgy and specific regulations on Cox as an Indigenous man. First-person narration of the story allows the reader to see directly into the mind of the protagonist. This allows a deep exploration of the senses of identity and belonging experienced by the protagonist. The story is non-linear, meaning that it does not move forward in a strictly chronological way. It often diverts in the protagonist's memory. Mundaroo often incorporates external sources, such as song lyrics and the writing of other authors, such as that of Samuel Beckett, who wrote Waiting for Godot. The novel is heavy on dialogue between characters. Notably, the dialogue is very realistic, punctuated with colloquialisms and contractions. This is used to reflect the way that people really interact. Uniquely, the text does not just imply a discussion of identity and belonging, but makes explicit references to both. The protagonist often thinks about his relationships with others and how he wishes to reject a sense of belonging. More importantly though, let's look at the big ideas of identity and belonging which emerge from Wildcat. Firstly, let's examine what comment the novel offers on the way that identity is formed. Overwhelmingly, Wildcat focuses on belonging and how its presence or absence can influence an individual's sense of identity. But there are many other factors presented as significant in the formation of a sense of self. How the protagonist was raised and that his mother's perspective on race is shown to influence him significantly, particularly as a child. His mother insists on rejecting his Aboriginal heritage and instead working to form connections with the white world, as she has done. She doesn't encourage Cox to see himself as white per se, but to fight to be seen as white by others. She says, "They belong on the white side of the fence. You've got to prove you do, and don't you forget it." The novel also touches on how an individual's identity can be influenced by those they respect and wish to emulate. The bodgy culture that manifests itself in many inmates and in Cox's milk bar friends is presented as a foreign ideal that has taken root in the mind of many Australian misfits. The protagonist thinks to himself that prisoners are a tough mob trying to talk and act like they thought criminals should, like gangsters in American movies. He doesn't think that they are actually gangsters or real criminals, but that they are adopting a persona to fit the stereotype of what they should be like. This is a demonstration of how one can assume an identity for themselves because of their situation, but the novel also discusses assumptions of identity for others. In particular, the university kids that Cox comes to hang out with briefly make assumptions about his identification with the Aboriginal culture because of his appearance and June's apparent interest in this aspect of his heritage. This group acts based on their assumption of Cox's identity, talking about Aboriginal issues and asking his perspective on them. Cox thinks to himself, "I don't know much about the Aborigines or how they feel." At this stage in the novel, his identity is far from Aboriginal. He instead sees himself as a misfit between worlds with links to no one and nothing. Nonetheless, the Aboriginal identity of others and Cox's 11th hour embracement of the concept allow for Mundaroo to explore the benefits of acknowledging one's heritage in the search for self. Before The Return, the protagonist's acknowledgement of his Aboriginality and interest in Aboriginal affairs is limited to the practicalities of his situation and government intervention in his life. However, upon meeting the old rabbit trapper in the bush, Cox's consideration of this aspect of his heritage takes a much deeper level. The old rabbit trapper's connection to his indigenous roots is clear, and he speaks about the Aboriginal conceptualisation of family, one which is much broader than the typical white Australia. I known your mummy and your grandmummy. That old woman, she been my tribal sister, you know. She called me brother. Only your mummy can't call me uncle anymore. She got to forget all that in the mission school. This encounter has a huge impact on Cox, both explicitly in his new way of thinking and implicitly in his changed behaviour. In particular, his attitude towards justice and morality is altered. When he attempts to steal money from the old man and is caught in the act, his reaction is not his usual of obstinate apathy, but instead of great shame. No judging me, only seeing how I am. I feel the blood lushing up my neck and over my face, and I hang my head. No one ever made me feel this way before. No one. Not the magistrate, or the probation officer, or the brothers with all that thunder about the eye of God. Not even my mum's suffering face. Leaving the encounter, Cox realizes that he doesn't know where the track is leading, but the bush seems more friendly now. He begins to embrace his identity as an Aboriginal Australian. Let's shift focus now and look at the novel's portrayal of belonging, specifically how belonging can be destructive. Despite his determination to remain alien from those around him, there's one particular sense of belonging that Cox consistently admits to feeling, that which he has built in prison. In this way, Mundaroo reflects on how one's desire to belong can contribute to the development of institutionalization. When leaving the prison, Cox comments that it is here that we were initiated into jail life, and for the first time donned the grey uniform of belonging. He often discussed his time in prison as being a time of surety in his life, where he understood things and his place amongst them. During his first stint in prison, his stint in solitary made him feel accepted, as I had never been accepted outside. The problem of this process isn't discussed explicitly, but the protagonist's rearrest at the conclusion of the novel highlights how it can be destructive for an individual. In essence, Cox does not like prison, or want to be an inmate for the rest of his life, but growing up within that system has made him somewhat reliant on the sense of belonging it instills, and left him unsure of how to be on the outside. To him, a prison is a refuge of a sort, where I was nearer to belonging than anywhere. When leaving the prison at the beginning of the story, Cox is torn between the beauty of the first freedom he's felt in years and wanting to pound on the locked gates and demand to be let in again. Later, he tells June that one difficulty in remaining outside the system for those with a record is this sense of belonging. For one thing, we make the only friends we have in jail, but if we're seen talking outside, we're arrested for consorting with crims. In this way, Mundaroo explicitly comments on the failures of the prison system to encourage the type of rehabilitation and reintegration that it presents as its aim. Instead, he paints a bleak picture of reoffense and acceptance of criminal activity as the only means of success and escape for the men incarcerated. Now, let's look at the influence of exclusion on belonging and the sense of self. Through the many groups that Cox rejects or is rejected from, Mundaroo explores the concept that exclusion can influence an individual's sense of self. This is explored in relation to several groups throughout the novel, notably organised religion and white Australia. Let's look specifically at the example of white Australia. Cox's interactions with white Australians are diverse, but always somehow afflicted by his sense of being different, even when others do not see it. June comments that she didn't even realise he was Indigenous, but Cox's conceptualisation of the conversation has been shaped by his knowledge that he is, whereas she is white. He comments on the beach, "Funny how they oil themselves over and bake to achieve the despised colour I was born with." His sense of self as a mongrel is always with him, often causing him to self-impose exclusion. As a child, he experienced explicit rejection from the white kids he was educated with. "Don't make trouble, son," Mum had said when I told her how the white kids laughed at me and kicked my case along the road. She'd hoped I'd make friends with them, but I never did. These interactions are made more complex by the fact that Cox is estranged from Aboriginal culture and identity as a child. Even when he does interact with other Aboriginal people as a child, he is somewhat excluded by his mother's desire for him to be part of white society. For example, he is teased about his la-di-da house. The protagonist is notably continually fearful of rejection, although he may not describe the sensation as fear. This leads him to stray towards self-imposed isolation and the surety he feels for his capacity to be accepted in prison. This leads us on to thinking about the way in which Cox excludes himself throughout the novel, and how sometimes there is an unwanted sense of belonging imposed upon him. Cox overwhelmingly rejects a desire to belong throughout the novel. He states to himself and to others that he wishes to have close relationships with no one and nothing. To the drunk girl at the university party, he says, "All things are alien from me. I am rejected and I stand utterly alone. Nothing is mine or belongs to me, and I belong nowhere in this world, or the next." These statements cannot be taken at face value forever. Cox is not without a desire to belong, and doesn't manage to stay alien from all things, despite his proclamation to the contrary. The false belonging that Cox shares with Denise is evidence of this. He expresses a desire for isolation, and yet is drawn toward intimacy, a contradiction that plays itself out disturbingly in their sexual encounter. He accepts this contradictory proposition in his statement, "I put my arm around Denise," and fake togetherness. Furthermore, the protagonist's offhand comments about the capacity for others to belong effortlessly emphasizes his true desire for that sense. In particular, he is struck by June's capacity to fit in. "Then I watch her move away across the lawn, calling out to a friend with that easy, belonging voice of hers. June effortlessly achieves the belonging that the protagonist cannot, but secretly wants." Another significant consideration for the concept of unwanted belonging is that of forced or prescribed groupings. This can be seen in Cox's interactions with the government, and assumptions from other characters based on his Indigenous heritage. The Australian government at the time this novel was written imposed categorizations on Indigenous people dependent on how Aboriginal they were and looked. These categorizations corresponded with laws that applied exclusively to these groups, such as those relating to alcohol and welfare. The last vestiges of the stolen generation and plainly racist and paternalistic policies can be seen in Cox's interactions with the government. In particular, his extended internal monologue about whether or not he will be served alcohol at the bar, being both underage and a quadroon, emphasizes Cox's feelings that he has been subjugated to white rule against his will. The effect of this forced belonging is clear, that Cox identifies himself as a quadroon, a fundamentally racist and hurtful word. This has the effect of making him bitter towards the system, that any respect for the system is to accept its rule over him. He is disdainful towards the magistrate and the idea of self-improvement through the boys' home or prison. This sentiment allows Mundaroo to explore the consequences of Indigenous people being subjugated to a foreign legal system that does not offer recognition or respect of long-standing Aboriginal history or culture. This plays itself out in Cox's mind. When June suggests that it is up to him to determine whether or not he winds up back in jail or makes something of himself, he thinks, "I feel the old bitter taste of resentment in my mouth. Nothing ever up to them. Only up to us, the outcast relics in the outskirt camps, the lazy, ungrateful, rubbish people who refuse to cooperate or integrate or even play it up for the tourist trade." Finally, let's talk about the ways in which the book explores a changing sense of belonging. The protagonist's sense of belonging is not static throughout the novel, but moves and changes as he ages. His first sense of belonging is one that most of us begin with, family. As a child, he thinks to himself about his mother, that there are only two types of us against the world. By the time the novel begins, Cox has rejected his connection with his mother. He is critical of her rejection of Aboriginal culture at times, and laments spending time with her. Instead, when the novel first begins, he identifies as a crim, and in some ways, linked with the bodgy lifestyle in prison. However, when Cox is released, he questions this grouping. As he approaches the milk bar after his release, he thinks to himself, "I wonder whether I still consider myself a member of this bodgy element. I don't want to belong to them anymore. They're a pack of morons, clueless, mindless idiots. What about this other mob? No good pretending I could ever belong with them, even if I imagined life would be any better if I did." For a time, Cox questions if he could belong with June's uni crowd, but is quick to reject this idea. He fears being rejected by them because his insecurities suggest to him that they are fundamentally different in terms of class, race, and life experience. Again, this sense shifts in the final part of the book. Cox moves back towards his prison connection as he moves away from the university crowd. But during his flight from the scene of the crime, Cox is struck with a new sense of belonging, that with the Aboriginal community. He moves forward with a sense of purpose, to own up to his act and serve his time without resubscribing to a sense of inmate belonging. This is just a bit of a taste of identity and belonging within Wildcat Falling, but hopefully it gives you some good talking points for your next context piece. Make sure to check out the video on identity and belonging and how to write different context pieces. Thanks for listening, and happy writing.